affairs. First and foremost, I would like to send you all a kind, warm welcome to this big talk, inshallah. Thank you everyone for turning up and attending this talk. I am Sheikh Ismail and I will be chairing this event, inshallah. Now, first of all, I'd like to thank Brother Moazzam Begg for coming down and taking some time out of his very busy schedule to come and speak at the University of Leeds. Now, as you can imagine, with this talk being such large scale, with such a topic, there is an element of sensitivity that we have to be aware of, that we have to be cautious. Now, at the same time, the topic is very important, and it's crucial that we as Muslims understand how to tackle such a big issue that may or may not manifest itself directly, but nevertheless is always in there, integrated in society in one way or another. So I'd also like to thank University, I don't know if they're here, for allowing us to host this event, and the Union as well for being the first to approve this event. Now, as always, when we have a talk, a level of respect from the audience is required, but at the end, we will be having an open Q&A. We do encourage you guys to ask as many questions as possible. Myself, as the host, I am allowed to, basically I'm allowed to withhold an answer, but I can't stop anyone from asking the question as per university policy. I'm just reading the guidelines here. So we are committed to be the best students possible. We are committed to be the best Muslims we can. And in order to be the best Muslims we can, first of all, we need to understand our rights. We need to understand our duties. We need to understand how we can integrate into the society to benefit this society and also benefit ourselves and to learn and develop ourselves. So, this talk, Islamophobia, is going to be presented by Brother Moazzam Begg. Now, Brother Moazzam Begg, for those of you who aren't aware, is a British-born Muslim. Now, he was held as an enemy combatant in extrajudicial detention in the US, by the US government in Bagram and Guantanamo for nearly 3 years. So he was detained for nearly 3 years. Now, the most interesting thing was that he was held in Guantanamo, which is one of the most secure, one of the most high-profile prison cages, and yet he was released without any charge. Imagine this, sentenced for 3 years, and then released without any charge. A few questions to ask there. Now, after that, of course, he went on to become an author. He went on to become a public speaker. He went on to become a media commentator and an outreach director of CAGE, which is a London-based advocacy organization that aims to empower communities impacted by war and terror. And they aim to empower students and Muslims to first and foremost understand their rights, to understand how to stand and defend themselves. Now, in 2019, this year, he was actually included in the Muslim 500, which is a listing of the most influential Muslims in the world. So it's fair to say we owe a huge amount of respect to Brother Moazzam Begg. And without further ado, please, I'm going to just show you the quick itinerary. So, some exercise. So, first of all, we'd like to give a short reminder, and then we'll have the talk followed by Q&A, some announcements from the President, and then we'll also welcome some feedback, and as promised, we have food. Yeah, food. Yay! Okay, so, Bismillah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط ولا يجرمنكم شنآن قوم على ألا تعدلوا اعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون. You can see the translation. Now, the reason why I chose this ayah is because how significant it is. Stand firmly in justice. Be just regardless of what other people say, regardless of what other people do, regardless the pressure you are under to either lie, to either make a false accusation, or to sentence someone incorrectly. Stand firm in justice. And in another ayah, be just even if it's against your family, your friends, or yourself. Our religion preaches justice and fairness. It's very important that we understand this. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Brother Moazzam Begg.
Hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Dear brothers, sisters, friends, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Absolute pleasure and honor this evening to be addressing you here in Leeds. I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this gathering one that is of benefit for all of us in this layer and in the hereafter for those who believe it. I didn't know that he was going to first introduce this talk with that verse in the Quran, which is, "O you who believe, stand up as just witnesses for Allah, and do not allow your animosity of a people to cause you to do them an injustice. Be just, that is closer to God consciousness." In 2009, I toured around the United Kingdom, around Britain, with a former guard of mine. His name is Christopher Arrant. He was a soldier, a US soldier from Michigan, who was a guard in Guantanamo. And through the wonders of Facebook, he reached out to me and asked me about my work and wanted to seek forgiveness as a soldier. He said, and I quote, that when I was guarding you people in Guantanamo, I felt like I had become the very thing that I'd been taught as a child to hate. That I had become the equivalent of a Nazi concentration camp guard. That we held you without charge or trial. We abused you. We didn't give you any basic rights. And we demonized you and kept you away from your families without any access to the most basic things that any prisoner would get, including phone calls, including television, radio, newspapers, and most importantly, legal representation. You didn't have it. And so when he reached out to me, I said, "You are most welcome, my friend." And so he came along to the UK, and he met with me, and he met with other former Guantanamo prisoners. As you can see, I'm not a very tall person, but the other prisoners are quite big and huge. And I took him first for dinner to meet with all these other huge Guantanamo prisoners. And he didn't know what to expect. He didn't know whether they were going to embrace him or they were going to hit him out of vengeance. But there was not a single one out of the 10 that were present that didn't hug him and embrace him like a brother. And there were tears between the prisoners and the former guard. He had been part of the process. He'd been part of the machinery. He'd been an individual who's responsible. Just like, if you remember, those of you who know this, that the Nazi concentration camp guards at the Nuremberg trials said, in defense, we were just doing our job. That wasn't a defense in law. Even though that was the case here, and he wasn't as bad as a Nazi concentration camp guard, every single one of them not only forgave him, they embraced him as a friend and as a brother. And I had the pleasure of coming here to this university with him in 2009. And we toured a crowd across the UK. Now, why that's important is because it relates to this verse quite directly. That my oppressor, for a surety the United States of America was my oppressor. They abused me, they stripped me, they beat me, they ripped the Quran in front of me, they threw it in the toilet, they urinated on it, they stamped on it, they wrote words of profanity on it in front of us. Or when they take us for interrogation, you come back to your cell to find your Quran in pieces. For those of you Muslims, can you imagine that? Us Muslims believe that the Quran is the unadulterated word of God. It is the actual speech of God. It isn't like the Bible. It's not related by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or a story told. It is actually, we believe, the word of God. So to see it desanctified in this way would break us more than if you broke our bones. And yet, despite being part of that machinery, our ability, rather I say our duty to forgive such people is part of our very existence. It's part of who we are. It is our identity as Muslims. It is part of when we begin an action. A Muslim begins an action, he begins it with what? Bismillah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, the oft-forgiving, the most merciful. These are the most well-known attributes of the Creator. And if we are unable to disseminate mercy and compassion, even to those who have wronged us, then it is our souls that are in jeopardy. I know my talk here is about Islamophobia, and I will go on to that in a moment, but it's important that because we began with this verse, there's a price that you have to pay. If you're an abuser, a torturer, a jailer of people without charge or trial, a murderer, which the United States forces have been involved in, which British soldiers have been involved in. If anybody would have seen Panorama this week, you would know that British soldiers were involved in the abuse, the torture, and the murder, and the execution of Iraqi and Afghani civilians, including children. But I swear by Allah that whoever's involved in this kind of abuse, it will come back to haunt him. The one that is tortured will suffer some kind of PTSD, some kind of trauma. I can tell you that from experience. But they will heal. They will heal through their belief, through family, through community, through working with others, to helping others. They will heal for a surety. But how does the person that's been involved in physically, sexually violating a prisoner with his hands tied behind his back, how does a soldier who's told that he's supposed to live up the greatest ideals of society, that is a representative, even in their military uniform, of the most powerful, quote-unquote, democracies in the world, that espouse human rights, freedom, and dignity, how does such a person descend to the level of such abuse that in the worst case scenario it leads to murder? Murder of a prisoner with his hands tied above his head to the top of a cage with a hood placed upon it, being punched and kicked repeatedly, which is something that I saw with my own eyes until he was killed. How does that soldier or the interrogator that's ordered that soldier to treat him this way, how do they live with themselves? And the truth is, it's very difficult for them. If you look at the statistics of soldiers who return from war zones or from guarding people like in Guantanamo, they're shocking. The numbers of people that are involved in domestic abuse, suicide, attempted suicide, alcoholism, drug abuse, homelessness. Because if you do something to abuse another person, it will come back to you. And I'll give you just one example before I get on to the main subject, is that there was an interrogator in Bagram where I was held. And in Bagram I saw 2 people beaten to death, tortured to death. And you can see this in a film called Taxi to the Dark Side. It won the Oscar for Best Documentary in 2008. Taxi to the Dark Side. And it features the case of this particular prisoner who I saw beaten to death. And one of the guards, one of the interrogators, is in that film. And he was later, after being held in Bagram, he was later redeployed to Abu Ghraib, which is in Iraq, the famous prison there. And he was brought up for charges, first in Bagram for detainee abuse, and then in Abu Ghraib for abusing female detainees. When he came back, became an alcoholic, suffered from his own trauma, psychological problems, and he phoned me one day. He got my number through his lawyers and through mine, and he phoned me. And he said that meeting me and the other prisoners changed his life, and that he destroyed himself. He became known, his nickname in Bagram, was the King of Torture. That was his nickname. And Monster, that was his other nickname. And by the end of the conversation, this huge, giant Italian-American guy with tattoos all over his arms and body, and former soldier, was crying on the phone, bawling like a baby because of the abuse that he carried out. And the reason why this is important, my dear brothers, friends, and sisters, is because today, that was at the time of George Bush. George Bush was the President of the United States of America. Under him, they had a program that was called Enhanced Interrogation Techniques. Enhanced interrogation techniques include something called waterboarding. Waterboarding is a technique that was used during the Spanish Inquisition. In Spanish, it's called tortura del agua, torture of the water, where you tie a man or a woman with their hands and their legs and their head to a board, and then you pour water over their noses and their mouths, and you make them feel like they're drowning even though they're not submerged. It was a technique that was used during the Inquisition against Muslims, against Jews, and against heretically deemed Christians. It was later used by the Japanese against American GIs, POW GIs, and these Japanese soldiers who did it were prosecuted for war crimes and executed by the Americans as a result. This technique was used by Pinochet, it was used by the Nazis, it was used by the British government against the IRA. It's recently been used by ISIS against some of their captives, but most importantly, it was used by the United States government against several people, including Abu Zubaydah, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and others who were held in Guantanamo Bay to this day. Abu Zubaydah was waterboarded over 83 times. The United States government at the time said that this is not torture. These are enhanced interrogation techniques. In fact, Donald Rumsfeld had argued, the most senior legal advisor to the United States government, Alberto Gonzales, had argued, remember the most senior legal advisor, the Attorney General, had argued for it to constitute torture, for it to be torture. If it isn't severe physical impairment, organ failure, or death, it's not torture. Pulling out somebody's fingernails is not torture. Tortura del agua is not torture. It's just enhanced interrogation techniques. I want you to understand this from a structural level, because it's the lawyers who crafted the language, and its application was on Muslims. And I venture to say that the war on terror can only be described as a war against Muslims. And I'll tell you why. There are terrorists from all over the world. Anders Breivik was a terrorist. Brenton Tarrant is a terrorist. Brenton Tarrant who carried out the attacks in the mosques in New Zealand. Anders Breivik who carried out the attacks in Norway. In fact, if you look at the statistics of Europol, which is an organization that puts out the statistics of terrorism, they said up to 2016 that out of the acts of terrorism carried out in Europe, in Western Europe, 99.7% of those acts of terrorism were not carried out by Muslims. But guess what? The first condition to be a prisoner in Guantanamo is that you must be a Muslim. That's why there are no real IRA members. There are no white nationalist, far-right murderers and terrorists or extremists in Guantanamo Bay. You won't find anybody from the EDL going to Guantanamo Bay, or from National Action, or any of the other scores of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant groups that exist here or elsewhere in Europe. You won't find any of them in Guantanamo Bay. So that is the only conclusion you can come to, that it is a war against Muslims. The second condition is that you must be a terrorism suspect. And once you've got that happening, you've got a president that comes afterwards, President Obama, and he says that we tortured some folks. In fact, I remember when Chris, the soldier I was talking about, came, at that time it coincided with Obama coming into power. And Obama said that when I come to power, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to close Guantanamo. I'm going to stop the renditions program. And I'm going to end torture. Why would you end something that you're not doing? Why would you end something that you're not doing? Your previous government said that we don't do torture, we just do enhanced interrogation techniques. So he recognized that America was torturing people, and he said so. We tortured some folks. In fact, he actually said that the torturing of individuals in the war on terrorism led to the unintended consequence of the rise of ISIS. It was the torture of individuals that, particularly the case of Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, which was a Libyan person that was tortured by the Egyptians at the behest of the Americans. And that information was passed over to Colin Powell, who was the United States Secretary of State. He gave that information, false information, that Saddam Hussein was working with Al-Qaeda on obtaining weapons of mass destruction. And that was presented to the United States Security Council, United Nations Security Council, to invade Iraq, based on tortured evidence, based on lies that turned out to be false. Why has nobody heard of Ibn Sheikh al-Libi? When Colin Powell, the US Secretary of State, relied upon the tortured testimony of this man to invade Iraq. Why does nobody know this man's name? He was sent after this statement that he made. He was sent to Libya and turned up in his cell dead in Abu Salim prison in Libya, which I visited in 2012. Hanged himself, apparently. Why did they even send him to Gaddafi? I thought Gaddafi was our friend. So lie after cover-up after cover-up. And then they invade Iraq. And Iraq is destabilized. Al-Qaeda that didn't exist in Iraq before the invasion comes in and sets up. And incrementally becomes Islamic State in Iraq. And then becomes ISIS when the Arab Revolution happens. And then ISIS becomes Islamic State. Can you see the cycle? And tell me this, who has been held accountable? Which single politician has been held accountable for taking us to war in Iraq? Not a soul. How many people have been killed? Nobody knows, nobody cares. Because the Muslim dead, literally, and I say upon here, they do not count. Some people say 500,000. Some people say 10 million. Some people say 50,000. Nobody knows, nobody cares, nobody counts. It doesn't matter. Using all sorts of ordnance, all sorts of weapons. Donald Trump, a couple of years ago, dropped what they called, quote unquote, a Moab bomb. The mother of all bombs, they call it, in Afghanistan. It weighs 22 tons. Can you imagine a bomb that weighs 22 tons being dropped anywhere? This type of ordnance being dropped right through Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria without so much as an eyelid being battered. And this is what's happening at a state level. Now, if you would have seen this panorama the other day, on Monday I think it was, British soldiers are entering into Iraq and Afghanistan under the mandate of fighting the Taliban, fighting Al-Qaeda, and so forth. But all of the rules that they're supposed to follow, they end up breaking. I've met with British soldiers and American soldiers who served in both places. I've met with former members of the SAS who told me that from the get-go, from the beginning, they already started the dehumanization process of these individuals. That's why out of the hundreds, I mean literally hundreds of cases that were taken up by the Iraq Historical Abuses Tribunal, one person out of the hundreds of cases have been prosecuted. Now, we talk about Islamophobia, I want to bring it back down to here, to Britain. ISIS rises up. It starts its brutal executions and beheadings and torture of primarily Muslims who oppose them, and some Western hostages. And then they carry out attacks across Britain and France and Belgium and other Western states and Arab states. The result of their acts of barbarity hits you right here. Let's get back to the chain of causation. Britain and America invade Afghanistan. They capture people, they torture them into giving false evidence and false confessions. As a result of those false confessions, they invade Iraq, a sovereign nation. They destabilize that sovereign nation, and as a result of the destabilization, the breakup of the police, the breakup of the army, Al-Qaeda comes into Iraq, meets with the former Baathists who've lost power, and set up ISIS between themselves. ISIS carries out attacks throughout the world, and we start to change our laws here. That's the chain of causation, that's the trajectory. Here in Britain today, all of you, even what was read earlier on, is as a result of the PREVENT program, preventing violent extremism, making sure that nobody says anything that's too extreme. Trying to pass laws in this country that determine what is and what isn't an extremist. Theresa May tried to pass through law a bill called the Extremism Bill, which would determine who and what an extremist is. And they could be prosecuted for it. How do you determine an extremist? Let's have an example. 55 years ago, Malcolm X stood in the Oxford Union. The Oxford Union. The angriest black man in America, they called him. They called him an extremist. They called him all sorts of things, didn't they? But they allowed him to come to the Oxford Union. And he gave a speech, his last speech in Britain. And his speech ended about extremism. If Malcolm X was alive today, I don't think any university would allow him in Britain. That's how far we've gone. And what did he say? He said, if a person is exercising extremism in defense of liberty and freedom, that is no vice. And if a person is exercising moderation in the fight against injustice, I say that man's a sinner. So he turned extremism on its head. Mahatma Gandhi was an extremist, wasn't he? Because he railed against the British Empire. You know that half-naked fakir that Winston Churchill called him? He was an extremist. Yet they have a statue of him outside Parliament. A bigger extremist is Nelson Mandela, because he actually believed in armed struggle against the apartheid regime. He was part of the spears of the nation. Those of you who heard of Mandela, you probably have seen he was unjustly imprisoned. Oh, he was found guilty of terrorism by a white apartheid South African nation. And what did he say when he was sentenced? He said, to paraphrase, that my goal in life has been a principle that I've lived by. And if necessary, the fight against apartheid is one that I'm ready to die for. They put him away for 27 years as a convicted terrorist, an extremist, a radical, a fundamentalist. He came out to become the leader of the new South Africa. Those who celebrated and wanted him, celebrated his imprisonment, and wanted him executed from the Tory party of the old days. And I dare say those who grew up to become Tory leaders today. Today celebrate the man. There's a statue of him outside Parliament, celebrating him as a statesman. So what does extremism mean then? Does it mean anything? Is it definable? Or was it only ever going to apply to the Muslim community here? Because Islam is inherently extreme. Because Islam has created people that have carried out bombings. Therefore, Islam must be the cause of radicalism and extremism. That's the trajectory, and that's the world in which we live in. That an action or actions have been taken by our government that have caused the deaths of untold numbers of people, because as I said, their dead don't count. We, those who are descendants of Pakistanis or Iraqis or Yemenis or wherever you happen to be from the Muslim world, we who have still some connection with people over there, cousins and relatives still there, are deemed to be a fifth column. We don't really belong. And movements exist and start to push forward. Perhaps we thought it was starting from bottom up. Maybe it's the EDL, maybe it's Britain First, maybe it's the National Front, maybe it's National Action, maybe they're pushing it. But I venture that it's the other way round. It's the other way round. When decisions are made, the far right in this country are not decision makers. Tommy Robinson is not a decision maker. Katie Hopkins is barely a human being, but she's not a decision maker. They're not decision makers. They're rabble-rousers. The people that make decisions here are your politicians. And what's behind them, the machinery that exists behind them, the thing that says it's okay, the thing that says whatever a British soldier does on the ground in Iraq, Afghanistan, he will not be prosecuted. These are our boys. Our boys can do no wrong. No matter where they are. They're wearing the Union Jack. They're wearing the Star-Spangled Banner. They are spreading democracy around the world. They do no wrong, and they cannot be prosecuted. And if there is one or two of them, then they're simply a bad apple. There's nothing systematic about it. As if war wasn't systematic. As if the order of war, as if what led to the war, as if the justification of the war, as if the machinery that built the war and executes the war is not systematic. As if dropping bombs on villages where young children live, where you know or ought to know human beings live there, you say we take an estimated strike and risk, and if they die, collateral damage. In this country, in Britain, since 2000, we've had a new law passed almost every year, that is to do with terrorism, a counter-terrorism law, an anti-terrorism law. You have Schedule 7 of the 2000 Terrorism Act. Schedule 7, according to a Cambridge University study, according to this, people are, just so you know the law, that you can be stopped by the police at the ports of entry and exit in this country, airports or other ports, and be held for up to 6 hours without charge, without trial, and most importantly, without suspicion, without reasonable suspicion by the police. So to get the context, one of you commits a serious crime outside, a very serious crime, hands themselves into the police and says, I have committed murder. The police officer is required to tell you that you have, say it for me, the right to remain silent. He's required to tell you that, because you do. You've committed a serious crime. He's required to tell you that you have the right to remain silent so that you don't incriminate yourself. Right? If you get stopped under Schedule 7, you have no right to silence. Even though, under Schedule 7, there is no reasonable suspicion. The police officer doesn't require reasonable suspicion. They can hold you there for 6 hours and question you, and you're required under pain of law to answer every single question. You're going to get to the good bit in a minute. They can take your DNA, your fingerprints, your photograph, strip you naked and search your property, and you have to submit to it all. If you resist any of those things, including the password or the passcode to your iPhone or to your tablets or your electronic devices, any of those things that you resist and you fail to comply, you can be arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. As what? What do you think? As what? Convicted as what? Say it. This is the Britain we live in today. Say it. As a terrorist. As a terrorist. You will be convicted as a terrorist for refusing to cooperate. Now, terrorism, what is terrorism? The use of violence for a political or ideological objective. Where was the violence? The violence here was by the state, not by you. That's what happened. That's Britain today. This isn't Iraq, it's not Syria, it's not Egypt, not Guatemala, it's Britain, the land of habeas corpus, the land of Magna Carta. Magna Carta has 3 clauses that are still relevant today. One of those clauses says that to no man shall justice be delayed or denied, except that they will be judged by a court of their peers. How is it then that Britain was completely involved in detaining people without trial or trial? In Iraq, Afghanistan, and in Britain. And I was one of them. So, at Schedule 7, the Cambridge University report in 2016, at one airport alone, said that 88% of the people stopped under Schedule 7 were whom? Who? Say it, brothers and sisters, just say it. Muslims. Why Muslims? Why not any non-Muslims? Tell me why. Tell me. Because it's state-controlled, structural racism. What's the percentage of Muslims in this population? How many are we? 50 million? 60 million? Taken over completely? No? Not yet? 3 million perhaps, maybe 4 to push it. We're about 3 to 4% of the entire population. So, is that not structural? If you look at the newspapers and how often they talk about a Muslim-related story, one way or the other, that affects us all. If you look at the statistics done by organizations like Men who've spoken about Islamophobia in the workplace and how Muslims are being targeted, how Muslim women are targeted, how they're physically targeted by Islamophobes, by neo-Nazi types or far-right type people on the streets, that they are the most visible manifestation of Muslims, therefore they get targeted. And there is a lot to be said about that. The rise of Islamophobia happens every single time that there is a terrorist atrocity, whether that terrorist atrocity is done by Muslims or against Muslims. There was a spike in anti-Muslim crime and hatred after Brenton Tarrant walked into the mosque in Christchurch and live streamed, when he got his whatever rifle he was using, live streamed as he put bullets one by one into each person because they were Muslims. Brenton Tarrant, you could say, is an anomaly. That's not what's happening in Britain, it's not what's happening elsewhere. And you may be right in saying so. But I will put something to you that make you think, oh my God, I wasn't expecting this. Thus far, we've been talking about the far right. Thus far, we've been talking about the far right and its views and how they become mainstream also. You can see like a guy like Tommy Robinson, who can barely spell or write, but he becomes an advisor to something called UKIP. Like he's an advisor to UKIP. And who headed UKIP? Who founded UKIP? Or at least headed it? Nigel what? Farage. What did Nigel Farage do? Did he bring an earthquake in Iraq or Afghanistan? No. He brought an earthquake in British politics, which he said that's what he's going to do. He said he's going to bring an earthquake to British politics. He's not an elected MP, but he's one of the most powerful and most influential people in Britain. So I forgot my point totally. But these guys are not the ones, the Nigel Farages are not the ones who are dictating the laws. They're simply pushing them. When somebody like Tommy Robinson and others can say, I completely support Boris Johnson. And what does Boris Johnson stand for? I'm not making a political statement here because I'm going to tell you the thing that you're going to be surprised about in a minute. We expect it from them. One of the reasons why there's the far-right street movements aren't so strong in Britain, we've got the Football Lads Alliance, we've got Britain First and all these others. They come and they go, they rear their ugly heads and they get smacked down and do something stupid. You know, there's Paul Golding, there's a one, sorry for going on the tangent. Paul Golding, he's standing outside a halal shop and he's saying, what's wrong with these people? Everything's halal around here. You can't even get can't go anywhere. I just want a non-halal chicken tikka. You idiot, chicken tikka was introduced by Muslims. American interrogator asked me if I knew somebody called Abu Khabbab, but he couldn't say Khabbab because he couldn't say the kha, and he couldn't do the shadda, which is like the emphasis on the ba. So he said, do you know Abu Khabbab? And I exercised my right to remain silent at this point, but I couldn't anymore. I couldn't. I just broke the downburst. I said, I'm sorry, I don't, but I do know I'm good at what chicken tikka. Getting back to it. So, we know what Boris Johnson says about Muslim women. Muslim women within the party, they look like bank robbers and God knows what else. We expect that. The views of the far right, in many ways, have been mainstreamed, and the evidence for that is the most powerful man in the world retweets Britain First, doesn't he? He talks about Muslim bans. He actually says things that are incoherent all the time, like Islam hates us. I mean, how the hell do you say that? Islam hates us. You can say Muslims hate us. But there you go. There's the most powerful man in the United States of America. Brenton Tarrant, however, praised the communist regime of China in his manifesto. This is the part I was going to tell you about that perhaps you weren't expecting. Brenton Tarrant, in his manifesto, praised the communist regime of China for its treatment of the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs of East Turkestan. And those of you who know or may have heard of, that the Chinese government is imprisoning, torturing, and incarcerating and forcing Muslims to renounce their faith in these concentration camps where over 1 million are held. Han Chinese non-Muslim people are sent to go and live in the house and sometimes sleep in the same bed as a Muslim woman while the husband is in prison. Children are sent off to orphanages, quote unquote, while their parents are still alive. Xi Jinping actually said in a released report that he wanted his people to use some of the language of the war on terror after September 11th in order to justify the treatment of Muslim prisoners and people, indigenous Muslims of that region. Now that is not far right. That's not the far right at all. That's actually that's closer to the far left. So how do these ideologies, when it comes to Muslims, how do they converge? Why do they use the same language? Why does Aung San Suu Kyi, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for fighting for democracy in Burma, why does she justify the killing, the rape, the murder, ethnic cleansing of Rohingya Muslims in the Rakhine province in Burma? Or rather, how does she do it? She does it by saying, these are terrorists. These are Muslim terrorists. The same thing that the Chinese government says, that Islam is a mental illness. It's a disease. We have to force these people out, re-educate them out of this disease. So what you can see across the board, and in the despotic Arab regimes that exist, they've been doing it for a long time anyway. So wherever there are Muslims who are strong, confident, articulate, strong in the belief of justice, لا تظلمون, as the Quran says, ولا تظلمون. Do not oppress, but do not be oppressed. Whoever raises his hand, whoever raises his head and stands up, they beat them down. Physically, psychologically, mentally, financially, in every way possible. And so you can see the nature of how Islam at a world stage, Islamophobia at a world stage is being applied across the board, is complete, and it's on the rise. And everybody is using the language. Now, I come back to my friend Chris, because he's also part of the machinery. He's also an ordinary person. He's not a Muslim, and he's come from a completely different background. But he saw it early on. He saw it in Guantanamo. There were others who saw it in Guantanamo, and they started to speak out against it, and they were arrested for fraternization with the enemy. They were targeted. Some of them were imprisoned. But that's what it takes. One lone voice to help to bring about the change. That they've stated their position for the record. It doesn't matter whether they're able to change anything. They've stated their position for the record, and history will remember. And so, my dear brothers and sisters and friends, the day-to-day Islamophobia that we experience on the streets has happened because of those wars over there, and as a result of those wars, we passed laws in this country. In 2006, there was a law passed called the Glorification of Terrorism Act, or that's what it's nicknamed. The Glorification of Terrorism Act. It's hard to prosecute people under it because you're Britain. You're Britain, the land of freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the land of Shakespeare, the land of Wordsworth and Tennyson. So how do you prosecute people for writing poetry? Only that people who wrote poetry have been prosecuted. How do you prosecute people for writing and publishing and distributing books in the land of publications, in the land of literature, that exports literature to the rest of the world? The English language is the most widespread language in the world. How do you prosecute people for publishing books? Only that people have been in Britain prosecuted for publishing books. I say people, but I mean Muslims, and I mean only Muslims. How do you develop a law that says every teacher, every lecturer, every nursery attendant, every doctor, every health worker, every social worker, every prison officer is required to report to the police or to the prevent officers what they deem to be signs of extremism? Perhaps putting on a hijab when you never used to wear one. Perhaps growing a beard when you used to be clean-shaven. Perhaps being confused about your political identity or religious identity. Perhaps caring about what happens in the rest of the world. Perhaps actually believing in the right to self-defense against foreign occupations. All of that can and will be seen as extremism, and you can be reported to the police or to the prevent officers, and it goes on your record for the rest of your life. How can that happen in a land of such freedom? How can there be a law like the one that was recently passed, the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Act, which designates you to be a terrorist, not because of anything you did, but because of where you went? So if you happen to go to a place in the world where there is conflict, and the government has deemed that that conflict may have terrorists there, and you could be, your duty is to, the onus is on you to say why you went there, even if it happens to be the birthplace of your forefathers. So this is the kind of situation that's existing, and every year you'll find, if you look, that the government is trying to introduce law after law after law. And the primary, the people that are primarily affected by this law, by these laws, are Muslims. They try to counter it by saying, oh, we're also applying it on the far right too. Well, if it's bad for us, it's bad for them too. And one of the reasons the far right is on the rise is because of the demonization of Muslims. When I was growing up, and I'm going to end here, when I was growing up, I was beaten up by skinheads. I used to see them in the streets in Birmingham, Spark Hill, walking up and down, marching. Sikh Heil, Pakis out, Wogs out, you see it all the time. Tattooed, NF on their foreheads, APL, Anti-Paki League. Used to see it all the time, we used to fight them. We used to get beaten up by them, but we used to beat them back too. But they never hated just Muslims. They hated anybody who wasn't them. And they hated blacks, they hated Asians, they hated Arabs, they hated Eastern Europeans, and mostly they hated the Irish. Because the Irish were the terrorists back then, not us. We've taken the baton on for the Irish. But they grew up. Some of them donned suits. And I don't mean shell suits. Track suits. I mean suits, proper suits. And some of them, they grew their hair and they took politics and political parties, and some of their views became more and more mainstream. And then they started to say that actually the problem isn't everybody else. Everybody's cool. We're like everybody else. Imagine a far right neo-Nazis saying, I like everybody else. It's just the Muslims, they're the problem. The Muslims are the problem. And that has been the language since the beginning of the war until now, that the Muslims are the problem. And that's how the far right has managed to push its agenda and its views across the board. So what do? I am the outreach director of an organization called CAVE that has been campaigning against these laws and these measures since the beginning, since I was released from Guantanamo. We first, at the top level, identified governments that were fully involved in our torture, in the abuse, Islamophobia at the highest level, in murder. We took them to court. We took MI5 to court for complicity in torture. We gave evidence to the International Criminal Court about our abuse. We gave evidence to the police. Think about this. I sat with the police, Metropolitan Police, and gave them evidence that MI5 agents were physically present when people were being murdered and tortured. They didn't do anything about it, but at least I registered the point. Inquiries were ordered as a result of us pushing. Nothing came of it. We never expected anything to come of it, because these governments pull rank and they cover up. But we made sure that we did our duty. So our point is to make sure that all of you, whatever you're studying, wherever you happen to go to, ensure that you've heard the message from us. What you do with it is up to you. I've spoken here before in the past, and I know members of Leeds University who actually joined us and went on to do great things in the human rights world and elsewhere. They held on to their identity as Muslims. They didn't shake. They didn't fear when they were attacked. But they went on to ensure that there was a record in history. So that's our point. That's my point in speaking to you guys this evening, is ensuring I've delivered a message to you that might be heavy. You might not even believe it. You can go and check it out for yourselves. But that message, once it's delivered, in the Muslim community, in the Muslim, we say that the Quran, that the verses of the Quran is hujjatun lak or hujjatun alayk. That it's either an evidence for you or an evidence against you. And so my duty here really is to radicalize you. Yeah, prevent officers, I say it. Because being radical, if you weren't radical, women wouldn't have the vote in this country. If there were no radicals, black people in America wouldn't have equal rights. If there were no radicals, and I'd say even more than that, extremists, there'd still be apartheid South Africa. So when something is wrong, we are duty-bound to fight against it, no matter what they call us. And so I hope that inshallah, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that anything that I said that is good, that you take from it. Anything that I said is bad, and you blame yourselves because you didn't understand what I said. And I'm going to end it.
أتيت بذنبي يا نور فؤادي وهل ترضى عني وقد فنى زادي